This is the On Humans podcast, a show which makes new research about humanity more accessible to everyone and more meaningful to the big questions about our self-understanding. I'm your host, Ilari Mäkelä, and today we're going to tackle head-on some of the greatest questions of history, some of the most hotly debated issues in the human story. In particular, we're going to look at making of the modern map, where on the one side you have a smaller group of rich countries, mostly Western Europe, their colonial offshoots, US, Australia, etc., and a few select East Asian countries such as Japan and South Korea. On the other side, you have the countries that are sometimes called developing countries, sometimes the global south, whatever you want to call it, and however blurry that line has become, the line exists. It's the backbone of how we understand much of modern history and how we understand all sorts of issues today, especially global inequality. So, how to explain this line? This is one of the most monumental questions, of course, in understanding of history, and it is a question where there are few case studies as illuminating as Britain and India. Did colonialism make Britain rich and India poor? Or was it actually Britain being richer that allowed it to colonize India? And if so, how did Britain get rich in the first place? So these are going to be some of the themes that guide what follows. This is not a regular episode. This is actually a live recording of a talk that I gave at the British Academy on these subjects. The context was the launch of Bishnupriya Gupta's book, An Economic History of India, that has been covered on the show before. And, I was delighted, very surprised, but very honored to be invited to give a talk at this event after some of the leading experts of Indian history speaking before me. So that was an experience. It's going to be divided into three parts. Roughly the first half is about the deepest signs that we can find about Britain getting richer than India, or India getting poorer than Britain. A second half is about colonialism and empire. And in the very short third part, Bishnu will be giving her comments. To accompany this episode, there is an article that you can read on the origins of modern India that you can find for free at onhumans.substack.com. There's a link to it in the show notes. And if you want to dig not deeper but broader into the story, check out the Origins of Modern China article. You can also find that at onhumans.substack.com. But without further ado, I hope that you enjoy this. Let's get started. If you're new to On Humans, welcome. If you want more of this, definitely hit the subscribe button. And if you like the show, you can just hit the 5-star review if you think that I deserve it. On Spotify, we're rapidly climbing towards 100 5-star reviews. So let's keep it going. Wonderful if you can put your input into that. And hey, before we get started, to all the wonderful people that support this work at patreon.com/onhumans, thank you so much. Your support really matters. And this episode, as always, is for you. So without further ado, let's dive straight into the halls of the British Academy. Enjoy.
What a great privilege and a pleasure to be speaking about such an exciting topic to such an erudite audience today. So thank you, Bishop, for inviting me. I am the last speaker, and I have some bad news, which is that saying last but not least does not apply, because I am, without any question, the least when it comes to academic merits who will be speaking here. I don't come from history or any serious scholarship. I come from an attempt at making serious scholarship accessible and meaningful to the general public. And I thought that given my lack of expertise with the subject matter itself, what would be something that I could offer this room today? And I realized that one of the things that I've learned during my years of interviewing scholars is that a strategy that works phenomenally well is that I will explain their work in very simple terms, and then they will tell me why I'm wrong. It never fails. And so I will attempt this today. And I will attempt this by highlighting a couple of points which, for someone like me who comes from outside of the field and looks at this work and thinks, what is the big picture? What would humanity's self-understanding miss if there would be some kind of malicious monster, an evil eminence that tomorrow takes the book away from us and deletes it from our memories? What would we lose? And I think that we would lose a great deal. And as has been suggested already many times, one of the things where we would be in the dark compared to where we are now would be our understanding of the Great Divergence debate. The Great Divergence being a topic that no serious account of the human story thus far could really fully avoid. Why is it that the tremendous boom in health and wealth in the last 100 or 200 or more years has been so unevenly distributed around the world? Well, we don't know. But we would be very, very ill-advised to try to answer it without being familiar with what Vishnu's research, together with Stephen Broadberry and many others, has taught us. Now, Ken Pomerantz, in his book, The Great Divergence, aptly titled, claimed that the world around 1800s, a little bit before that, was a world of, quote, surprising similarities, where the alien scientists looking at Bengal and the Yangtze River Delta and the British Isles could not have guessed really which of these is going to be leading the world, or at least could not have guessed without having done some modeling on coal deposits and ghost acres in America. This world of surprising similarities was very well argued in the book, but as Vishnu told me during our conversation, this was the beginning, not the end. There was not very much actual data. So what does the data tell us? And this is one of the reasons why this book is so much more than just a contribution to Indian economic history. It's a contribution to the human story, is because here India is an amazingly rich case study of this question of the Great Divergence. And there was one table in particular in the book which I urge that even if you do not read the full book, go to the chapter 1 and find the table which compares wages in India and in Britain during the past 400 or so years. And it's a phenomenal product. I mean, there's so many tens of years of scholarship that are boiled into this one table. And sure, some of the numbers might be off, but we get a very, very clear picture and we get a clear paradox. The clear picture is that Pomerantz was not exactly right. The divergence started happening earlier. The Great Divergence started before the Industrial Revolution in Britain. However, if we look at living standards, and here's one horn of the dilemma, which I mentioned. If we look at living standards, around 1600, during the Queen Elizabeth I, passing away in England and Emperor Akbar ruling India, the Mughal Empire in India, the living standards are surprisingly similar. Britain is ahead a little bit, but it's not more ahead than, say, US today is ahead of UK. We wouldn't call it a great divergence between the US and the UK, or maybe we should soon. But not yet. And this is where we were. I mean, some of the estimates suggested that 80-90% of the standard of living of the London unskilled worker could be achieved by an unskilled worker in Agra. Not a great divergence yet. Then something happened. What happened? Again, we don't know. But India's living standards started declining, and they started declining while British living standards started going up. And all of this happens clearly before the Industrial Revolution, clearly before the steam engine, clearly before the events in Bengal to the latter half of the 1700s. I would love to know the answer. I do not know the answer. If someone knows, please contribute to the conversation afterwards. But at least we have this question. We have this question, which is much, much better question than what happened with the Great Divergence. Is how did the small edge that Britain had in terms of living standards become a big edge? Why did India living standards actually go down? Was this a product of wars? Was it some kind of Malthusian trap where India was locked in? If so, why wasn't Britain locked in it? Etc., etc. A lot of interesting questions. Now, I did mention earlier, though, that there's a paradox. And here's the paradox. If you look at the other table under the living standard table, you see the silver wage. The wage not of how much food, cloth you can buy as an unskilled laborer, but how much silver, how much bullion. Now, in some sense, this is the less interesting question, right? I mean, the whole beauty of the book is that it grounds economic history in the actual lived experience of real people. And this is very, very important. But I was shocked when I looked at the silver wage differences. The silver wage, in other words, the international buying power of an unskilled worker in Agra, according to this magisterial table, was roughly 20% of the British wage. I went to do some assessments and pretended to artificial intelligence that I am a construction worker in Mumbai searching for work and asking how much am I expected to earn during the next year. I got a couple of different answers depending who I asked, and then I went to Google and tried to find some sources. I don't exactly know how much construction workers earn in Mumbai today and how much construction workers earn in, say, Manchester today, but it looked like the difference was pretty much the same. In terms of international, not international purchasing parity, but in terms of nominal actual dollars, the difference is roughly similar today, around 20% in India. So we get this incredibly rich set of questions. What is going on? And this is what great scholarship, I believe, can at its best do, is to both give new answers, but while doing so, ask so many questions that decades of graduate students will be having a great work to do. How and why was this big divergence happening? My first guess was this must be the New World American silver flowing into Europe. Then I looked at the Spanish silver wage, and it's roughly the same as India. India here is not the outlier. Britain actually is the outlier. And because we are talking here about the economic history of India, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but this is an incredibly consequential question, I believe. Why was this gap already in place around 1600 between Britain and India? And it strikes me as very important a question when we try to understand why was it British ships that started arriving into Indian shores rather than vice versa. A deeply, deeply consequential question, not only for the history of India, but history of the world. So this would be my first take-home message from the book, which I'm sure soon Vishnu will correct in many ways, but at least my strategy at that point will have worked, which is that we have all learned something via my mistakes. You don't have to make the same mistakes. And now the second thing that I would say has to do with how we understand British colonialism. British Empire has been mentioned many times. It is the elephant in the room, in some sense, and especially in this room, in the belly of the empire, so to speak. A daunting task to address this topic to such a scholarly audience, especially given my lack of expertise with the subject matter, but I will nevertheless try. There's three things that could explain, or three broad themes that could explain the long shadow that the British colonial experience. And leaving aside the British Empire in general, it does seem to be that in the case of India, it was not exactly a recipe for economic success immediately when the British left. It was an inch away from optimal, one would say, or perhaps much more. So what exactly was this? Can we go beyond India was a rich and wonderful, splendid country, and then Britain came and destroyed it? Can we go deeper? Well, one very popular theory, if you go online, which I did when preparing for the interview, the most popular theory seems to be that Britain deindustrialized India. And this is true. India had a vibrant textile industry, which, by the way, was not completely independent of the Europeans buying a lot of that cloth, but there was a vibrant industry. And this declines dramatically during first the East India Company rule and later the Raj. But what was really, really important, and what I really took to heart from the conversation I had with Vishnu was that this is true, but look, this is luxury cloth. And it's wonderful to have a luxury industry, no problem. And it's devastating for the Bengali weavers what happened to this industry. But this is a very small slice of the pie. If we want to care about India in terms of the average person, the well-being of the average family, we're not going to look at the people who make luxury cloth for the British to buy in Bengal. We're going to look at farmers. And there is a wonderfully illustrative graph in this book where you can see the rise and the fall of the Indian textile exports. And they do really rise and they really do fall. And Indian GDP stays flat. Nothing changes. It is not inconsequential to the individual weavers, but it is inconsequential for the big picture of why India stagnated so deeply after first economic decline and then stagnation. This cannot be purely explained by this deindustrialization thesis. So what does really matter? Agriculture is one part, which the book gives a lot of tools, I think, to think about what the British colonial policy did and did not do for the agriculture. My vague impression is that if the agriculture, we have to distinguish between two kinds of agriculture. If the agriculture had to do with opium, for example, there might have been very, very nice irrigation channels built. If it had to do with food consumed locally, there might have been somewhat less impetus from London to invest. But the agricultural story is very complicated, and but it's also tragic in terms of numbers. The yields when the British leave India are roughly the same or lower than they were during the reign of Akbar. Immense stagnation. And this is under the rule of Britain, who, of course, in its own soil, orchestrated or oversaw, however we want to understand it, the greatest agricultural revolution of the early modern times, perhaps. And nothing like that in India. Why? I'm not the right person to answer, but this is a very, very important lesson to reflect upon. But there is something which I would like to finish with, which I think is perhaps the most important lesson for our time today, not just for history, but for understanding our moment, which I really took to heart from reading the book. And this has to do with education. And there's a deep, deep irony here when thinking about the rhetorics of the British Empire and the reality of it. It's not that no money was invested in education. There was investment. It was overwhelmingly, understandably perhaps, it was overwhelmingly invested into elite education to be able to produce what we might call the middle managers of the empire. This was a strategy which backfired, by the way, because Gandhis and Nehrus, oh my God, they were very eloquent. Very, very eloquent and very, very well educated. And perhaps the Brits came to regret this education policy. However, what the British educational strategy in India did never really attempt on a large scale was primary education for the broad masses. And why this was a really, really interesting point in Bishnu's book, because the book is so, for anyone who has a very, very strong nationalist or imperialist agenda, the book is annoyingly good at sticking to data. It does not allow you to just take one side and then run with it. And what I think that the book really forced me to think about is that empire can be violent and can also have economic benefits at the same time. And we don't therefore need to congratulate the empire. And an example of such colonialism in certain regards was Japanese colonialism in Taiwan and Korea. Massive, massive investments in primary education accompanied by terrible colonial violence. The British rule in India, despite all the rhetorics about bringing civilization, looks as a clear contrasting picture. Very, very, very little primary education. And then you look at the East Asian miracle and you compare it to Indian stagnation. And there are a lot of people out there who want to say it's because India is a democracy. Our democracies cannot grow so fast. But I would urge people to look at the literacy rates, especially the female literacy rate. In 1990s, the female literacy rate in China was around twice of India. And does anybody here know how to write Chinese characters? That takes time. So it wasn't the ease of the task that explains the great literacy in East Asia. Something else does it. And this, unfortunately, despite all the perhaps corrective about Nehruvian policies being not quite as devastating as they are sometimes presented as, in some ways I think that Bishnu's book also raises the question why, despite all the visionary policies of the Nehruvian era, why was this massive skew towards elite education at the cost of primary education not corrected in India? And I think that this is not a lesson just for India, it's a lesson for all countries trying to escape poverty. It is a lesson for all countries trying to stay rich. And I think that if there's a one theme that we can all take for the 21st century from this book, it is education, 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 and not only for the elites, but for everyone. And I thank you, Vishnu, for this wonderful book, and that brought all of these questions, and now it's your time to correct me. So my first question would be, please, tell me everything that I got wrong.
No, you got mostly right. So I'm just going to digress a bit, and I'm just going to say something about the idea of deindustrialization, and I'll talk about the wages that you were talking about. This is my work with Steve, which is there very much in the book, where we see British wages to be very high, the monetary wages, but real living standards not being that high, that different in 1600, and then the big divergence starting. And what I wanted to kind of mention here is that you see the decline kind of turning into stagnation during colonial rule. So it's hard to say from the data that because of colonization, you saw this big decline in living standards. It stagnates, nothing changes, so that's a problem. And that's a failure of colonial policy, but we cannot attribute it to the decline. The other thing I wanted to say about the deindustrialization question, it's exactly like the discussion on the China shock, Trumpism, whatever you can call it, that, it's products of from somewhere else, which come and displace industries in another country. The deindustrialization of India is very much that, where British goods produced much more cheaply and could be in the Indian market and create a mass market, basically displacing the local products. So this is, of course, a problem for the sector, but for the economy, as Ilari said, it wasn't a problem. And therefore, I think deindustrialization is a cause of colonization, and it's the main reason why India stagnated, I think, is misplaced. I don't see industry as a problem in colonial India. Industry in 1950 was exactly at the same place as in East Asia. Whereas if you look at agriculture, it's vastly different. So I kind of think the agricultural narrative is far more important if you want to understand India under colonization. So I think that's it.
So what I suggest I do is I will ask one or two questions, after which we will open the floor. And I guess the first question will be about deindustrialization. And this is something you and I already discussed, is that it's true that deindustrialization in India does not seem to really make a difference in the GDP or in the living standards of India as a whole. But could it have played a part in the education issue? Could it be that because a lot of labor was drawn from industry to agriculture, that there was less economic incentive for literacy, for education during the later part of the British rule, perhaps from a purely economic point of view? For example, perhaps someone could say that one of the reasons Japan invested so much in Taiwan, Korean education was that they actually had industry there. The Koreans produced a lot of the bullets for the Japanese, etc. And that if India would have had a bigger proto-industrial weaving sector, could that have tilted the balance away from the big problem with the primary education? Do you think that there is a possibility in which there's an interaction there?
I don't think so, because I think the industrial sector was really quite small. And out of that, the sector which supplied in the export market was even smaller. So it is true that sector declined and many people went back to agriculture. But even if they were all in the industry and got educated, it wouldn't make a difference in terms of the number, unless there was primary education creating a mass schooling system. I don't think that would solve the problem of human capital or literacy in India.
And unfortunately, we will have to end here. The conversation continued for almost an hour after this, but we couldn't get good quality audio from the conversation. But we already here have touched upon all the points that then we kind of drilled in deeper with the insights and the questions from the audience. If you want to spend more time with this topic, Bishnu's book is called An Economic History of India. It's a very remarkably short read, and despite being a scholarly book, it's very easy to follow, even if you're not used to reading economic books. And the 1.5 hours of conversations I have with Bishnu, you can find from the February episodes on this same feed. Also, if you want to spend more time with this, you can check out my essay on the birth of modern India, based largely on these conversations, which you can find for free at onhumans.substack.com. There's a link to the article in the show notes. But that's it for today. Thanks for sticking with us until the very end. As always, if you're new to the show, do hit that subscribe button. If you listen to some episodes and want to show a little bit of love, hit that 5-star button if you think that I deserve it. And if you're a long-term listener and you want to join the wonderful group of Patreon supporters, you can do so at patreon.com/onhumans. And whoever you are, wherever you are, I hope to have you with me next time in the next episode of On Humans. Until then, take care.